We're about to get started. The event is being recorded, as you just heard. I'm Ed Potasnik. I'm Executive Director of the New Jersey League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. And a little bit about us, we're a nonpartisan nonprofit. We're tax deductible, and we work to protect our precious natural resources by raising awareness for key environmental challenges and working to help improve the efficacy of the entire environmental community. We lead an effort called Flood Defense New Jersey, which is a coalition of state and local nonprofit organizations working to protect our communities from damaging floods and harmful stormwater pollution. Again, thank you for joining us. We're going to be talking tonight about an important issue here in New Jersey, which is stormwater management and what steps municipalities can take to address the issue on the local level. But before we get started with tonight's program, I want to do a little bit of housekeeping. I know that a lot of us have been experienced with Zoom and probably gotten pretty used to this format over the course of the last year plus. But I remind people to keep themselves on mute during the presentations to prevent any background noise or interference with our speakers. And then also, if you could please change your name so that it can accurately reflect who you are in the picture. And you can do that by clicking the over your picture, you just kind of mouse over, and in the upper right-hand corner, you click the 3 dots and then click rename. And you can actually make sure it says your name, not your child's or your spouse's, whoever was on the computer, iPad, etc. before you logged on this evening. And that'll be really helpful for us because that'll help us to track comments in the question and answer period of the presentation. If you can please type any questions you have throughout the presentation in the chat box. That's accessible at the bottom of the screen. You might have to mouse over it. If you don't see the thing that looks like a little cartoon bubble, you might have to click the 3 dots on the right, which is kind of like a more, and then will be one of the options that you can see. New Jersey LCV staff are going to be collecting your questions, and we're going to try as hard as possible to answer as many of them before we wrap up within the last 10 or 15 minutes. We've got about an hour set aside for this evening, again, to talk about stormwater utilities, because here in New Jersey, we are the most densely developed state in the nation. We suffer from having the most impervious surface of any other state, with about 12% of our land area being covered by hardened surfaces, things like pavement and concrete. And altogether, as we saw, it was just last week, we had these storms, and just a few days ago where inches of rain are coming down and overwhelming our communities. Unmanaged stormwater is responsible for about 60% of the pollutants in our waterways. So in addition to being a nuisance with flooding, causing damage to our businesses and homes, a lot of the pollution that is in our waterways, 60%, is coming from our hardened surfaces, picking those up along the way. That's because when it rains, chemicals and other dangerous pollutants on our streets and our parking lots, on our roads, they get washed into the storm drain, funneled into our rivers and lakes, and into our smaller streams that we use for recreation and drinking water, which makes stormwater a serious threat to not only public health and our homes and businesses. Currently, 95% of New Jersey's waters don't meet federal water quality standards. So that leaves just 5% of them left in a state that would be high quality. For more background, in 2019, the legislature passed the Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act, which was signed into law by Governor Murphy. The law gives municipalities, utility authorities, county governments the option to leverage handling this problem and addressing it through something called a stormwater utility. And for those of you who are not familiar with a stormwater utility, it's a dedicated source of funding that allows a town or a county or an existing authority to assess a fee based on a property's impervious surface and their contribution to stormwater pollution. And that helps to lead to improvements in drinking water quality and reductions in flooding. There is a reason to create a stormwater utility, and that is it follows something called a polluter's pay principle. Really throughout the nation now, there are over 1,800 stormwater utilities, and they exist in 41 states. The law in New Jersey requires us to issue credits for reductions in fees for folks who help to address their stormwater before it leaves their property, meaning less leaves and less pollution leaves, and because of it, you get a discount. So our speakers tonight will be discussing this in a lot more depth than what I just went over, but I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview. The thing to know is this is an expensive issue. Stormwater is an expensive issue. In total, New Jersey needs roughly $16 billion to update our stormwater management infrastructure. And with COVID-19 putting a tremendous strain on our municipal budgets, establishing a utility is a great way to free up revenue to address stormwater problems in a financially equitable manner rather than bonding or taking on more debt or increasing taxes. And while there are none yet here in New Jersey, many municipalities are taking steps to move forward and sort of explore these. Notably, in July of 2020, the town of Hamilton took a major step and used some grant funds to explore if a stormwater utility is a good option for them to address their stormwater management issues and infrastructure needs by undergoing what we're going to be talking about tonight, which is a stormwater feasibility study. So a recent update, the city of Camden passed a resolution in February of this year to accept a grant from New Jersey LCV Education Fund to do a stormwater feasibility study as well. And just for all of you who are tuning in, I know there's a lot of municipal folks will get a better sense of everyone who's here tonight. We do have a grant program for municipalities in the Delaware River watershed. If you're interested in learning more about that, Molly is available and can help, or really any of us at the organizations. Hoboken just recently was able to secure various grants to pursue one based on a resolution they just passed on July 7th. So with that, I'm going to give you a little bit of the lineup tonight. We're excited to be joined by two special guests from Princeton Hydro. A little bit about Princeton Hydro. Since 1998, Princeton Hydro has worked with over 10,000 water resource projects all over the state of New Jersey, including 2,000 clients altogether. Projects like dam removals, stream restorations, invasive species management are sort of hallmarks of the work that they do. They're committed to improving our ecosystems, our quality of life, and communities for the better. The firm provides integrated ecological and engineering consulting services with expertise in natural and aquatic resource management, water resource engineering, geosciences, and regulatory compliance. From concept to construction, Princeton Hydro collaborates with clients to create resilient, sustainable, regenerative, and natural-based solutions to help meet their respective missions. The firm was just honored at our gala with an inaugural sustainability award for their commitment to a sustainable future in New Jersey. And that was at our gala, the Green Tie Gala for New Jersey LCV. The first speaker from Princeton Hydro is Clay Emerson, who's a PhD, a professional engineer. Dr. Emerson is a director of green infrastructure and stormwater management at Princeton Hydro. And he works with a unique blend of both consulting and academic experience. He leads the infrastructure design and implementation review and inspection process sort of areas at Princeton Hydro. And he's worked on a number of multidisciplinary teams to help evaluate the impacts of urbanization on watersheds. And he's conducted extensive research on non-point source pollution control and water quantity control performance on stormwater as well. He's an adjunct professor at Villanova University and Rowan University, where he teaches courses related to water resource engineering. He's also actively involved in various professional organizations and sits on multiple state, both in New Jersey and Pennsylvania stakeholder groups with a focus on guiding state stormwater regulations and guidance documentation with respect to green infrastructure. You might not think he has any time with all the things that he's doing, but he assured me on weekends and maybe even some weekdays you can find him fishing. The other speaker from Princeton Hydro that we have, we're really pleased to have with us is Dana Patterson. Ms. Patterson is Princeton Hydro's Director of Marketing and Communication. She's a passionate environmental communicator who's bringing a strong mix of diverse stakeholder engagement experience as well as values-based communication strategy. She specializes in proposal management, branding, marketing, digital media strategy, and has held a variety of digital media positions in the nonprofit and academic sectors as well. She earned a master's of environmental management from Yale's School of Environment, and she holds a bachelor's of science in chemistry, which is my undergraduate degree as well, from Fairleigh Dickinson University. She's an active board member of Sustainable South Jersey and the Society of American Military Engineers New Jersey Post, and sits on the American Sustainable Business Council's Clean Water is Good for Business Steering Committee. On weekends, you can find Dana bird watching in parks, capturing nature's beauty through photography and exploring all kinds of new trails in the area. And again, as we go through the presentation, you have any questions, please type them in the chat. There's that bubble that I spoke about. And to round out the evening, we're going to hear from Bree Callahan, who is a stormwater manager at New Jersey Future. And I want to, before we get to our speakers, Clay's going to be up first. We have several partners here tonight that I wanted to thank for their hard work and for co-sponsoring this event. We have folks from the New Jersey Highlands Coalition, Pinelands Preservation Alliance, Association of New Jersey Environmental Commissions, New Jersey Future, who you'll be hearing from, New Jersey Sustainable Business Council, Raritan Headwaters, and the Camden Community Partnership, which many of us know by the formerly name of Cooper's Ferry Partnership. I also want to thank the folks at Jersey Waterworks for their co-sponsorship and all the work that they've done and they're doing with their members to protect New Jersey's water. And with that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Clay Emerson and Dana Patterson.
Okay, thank you so much. Ed, I appreciate the introduction. Most importantly, I appreciate you having us on here. So yes, we're going to talk about a stormwater utility, specifically a feasibility study, and how might one work for your specific community. And this is just generally what we're going to run through here. We're going to, myself and then Dana is going to follow up after me, and then we'll hear from Brianne Callahan from New Jersey Future, who has some excellent resources for those with continuing interest. So first, we're going to do a quick poll just to let us know a little bit about who you are and what you know about stormwater utilities to this point. It's just 2 quick questions. It's anonymous, and it will just take a minute. So if we can launch that. There we go. So just 2 quick questions. Which of the following best describes your primary role? And how familiar are you? And if you just indulge us and give us a moment there to let us know kind of where we stand. And I'll give that just another minute here. And then I will keep moving along. And it looks like so far we've got a good mix of folks in the audience, which is great. We expected that. And we also have a good mix of familiarity with stormwater utilities, but most of you understand the general concept. Okay, so Ed already alluded to this. I am preaching officially to the choir here, probably. If you didn't understand the issue of stormwater management, nuisance flooding, impaired water quality, you probably wouldn't be here with us tonight. So we know this is an issue. We know the weather is not what the weather was 10 years ago. If you've been in this field, you'd probably agree with that statement. And our infrastructure isn't getting any newer, right? Some of this material is just, the time is up for some of it. We talked about the water quality impacts. And another thing to point out in New Jersey, although somewhat unrelated to the utility question, there is a new updated rule in effect this year with some changes on how we manage stormwater. So on to the utility. What is it? What are some more details of how they work, and what do you need to look for, and what would a feasibility study really accomplish for you? What kind of questions would it answer? So we heard a little bit of the background. Ed set this up great. the New Jersey Clean Stormwater and Flood Reduction Act authorizes but does not require municipalities or other groups here to establish a stormwater utility, but it became a possibility. It can be done on a municipal level. It can also be done on a county level or different utility authorities that could be set up, multiple municipalities. We'll talk more about that later. But here's the big picture. We all want the background picture here. We want fishable, swimmable. We want stable hydrology. We want high water quality. We want all those things. And this is a local picture here, South Jersey. But we know the reality of what Ed said, the most densely populated state in the country. And what we get often is the bottom picture there, which it may just look like a pipe discharging stormwater to stream, but a lot is summarized in that picture. You've got the poor water quality, right? The muddy water that you see going by. And you have the cause and the effect all in one photo there. You have the stormwater being discharged to the stream. That pipe is going to need to be replaced. You can see it's a CMP pipe. It's up in terms of its lifespan. And where did all that sediment come from? It came from the stream bank that has receded, 10 or 20 feet there. So a lot is summarized there. And the stormwater utility brings us a mechanism to start to chip away at this problem. And really what we're talking about here is a user fee for a specific service. So fees are collected proportional to the use to address the costs associated with the service. So the user, quote, fee-paying public receives a benefit from a service. And of course, they have the opportunity to reduce their use. And it's a dedicated funding source, and it's a transparent fee for service. Now, it's not quite as black and white as your water supply. Okay, it's a little bit different, but I think after today's presentation, it'll seem a little more perhaps straightforward. So again, it provides us dedicated stable revenue source to be used specifically for stormwater management purposes, but we'll go into what those purposes can be, and the list is long. And it enables you as a municipality perhaps to provide this proactive financial planning. And I know a lot of you are likely playing whack-a-mole with stormwater problems as they arise. So this is a little more or a lot more proactive than probably the way it's often done. So it also provides a mechanism to improve water quality and address flooding and improve public safety. And you might say, well, isn't that what the stormwater regulations do? Not really. Primarily a lot of the regulations are meant to be able to develop land, but not decrease water quality or increase flooding. There's some nuance there, but this unquestionably does provide for an actual uplift. So why are we talking about it tonight? Why are we here in New Jersey talking about this? Is it a new thing? Well, no, it's not a new thing, but in New Jersey it is. And as Ed mentioned, despite being the most densely populated state in the country, you could see that we don't have any stormwater utilities in the whatsoever. And there's just a few other states. So we're in the last probably 5 or 10 states, at least right now. We'll see where we end up on that list, but it is going to happen. I think we'll see in 5 years. There'll be a number of them within the state. And looking at this map, there's probably, they estimate close to 2,000 likely by now, and there's more and more every year. Some of them go back to the 50s. One thing you want to notice with this map is there's no real obvious political patterns. So it's not a blue issue. It's not a red issue. It's really, there's really no pattern there. In New Jersey, there are some specific things in that act that he mentioned that deserve mention. Agricultural properties per the Farmland Assessment Act are exempt. That could be an important thing for your municipality, or that could be a problem for your municipality. There's a lot of variation in the state. And as Ed also alluded to, a credit system of a fee reduction, and there's actually a couple tiers of this built into the act, is actually a requirement. And we'll talk more about that later. So again, I mentioned what can these firms, what can the revenue that's collected be applied to? And like I said, the list is long. So I'm not going to read this whole list, but anything that you can almost imagine related to stormwater management, whether it be public education outreach, design, construction, O&M, enforcement activities, the development of the utility program itself. And one thing that Dana will point out is this also enables a municipality to have dedicated matching funds that will put you at the top of the list for grant or low interest loan applications and things like that. So these are two snapshots of landscapes that are probably typical and can be found in just about every municipality nearly in the state. I would guess you have your big box development and you have your single family residential developments. And that feasibility study really needs to look at what's going on in your municipality and what that would mean for your different users, as they would be called. So the key is that this has to be fair and equitable. In terms of stormwater runoff, we can look at these two images and get a picture in our mind of who's generating the majority of the runoff. And again, that's, if you look at it on a net basis, that's going to vary across the different municipalities. So how does it work? We don't have a meter, like we do for our water bill, perhaps. But what we do have is impervious cover as a measure of use. And it's actually a pretty good one. We all know impervious cover generates a disproportionate amount of runoff. The good news is that it's readily measurable with the desktop GIS analysis. More on that in a bit. It certainly is equitable, and I think it's relatively easy. So I'm an engineer, so I'm required to have at least one equation in my presentation. So here I've got it covered. I always make sure to do that in any talk. Simply put, you have a revenue, you know what that is, or you have some past history of it. You have some documentation on what things have cost on an annual basis. You know what desired level of service maybe you want to get to. Maybe it's maybe you're falling behind on things, and you can readily find out what your total impervious coverage is, and you can set a general rate. So how does it actually get billed out? If you look into stormwater utilities, you'll hear a lot about an ERU, or equivalent residential unit, and it represents the impervious area and square footage for an average residential property in your municipality. Each property would then be charged a unique number of ERUs. So if your property happened to be the absolute average number of square feet, you would pay one ERU, which might be $5 or $7 a month or something like that. We'll talk more about that. A number of other states will also charge a blanket ERU for any residential property that they figure out through this process, but that's not gonna fly in New Jersey. It needs to be measured on a site-by-site basis. So a 10-acre box development like this, shown on the right, and this is from a municipality in Pennsylvania that has a stormwater utility. And that map, that the red area is the impervious cover, and there's a 125. So that box development generates 125 times the amount of the average residential unit in that municipality. So they would be paying 125 times more than the average single family homeowner, for example. So again, New Jersey will require this on a lot by lot basis. So, you have scenes like this. These homes are all in the same development, and you can see the original kind of layout of the homes and then the expansion and the pavement and things. So New Jersey does want you to go on a lot by lot basis, and that is equitable. It's a little more labor intensive than what's done in other places, but the reality is that the GIS systems are improving, and this might not be quite as labor intensive as it may sound. It's somewhat automated, and it's something that you really only have to do once, maybe update it every 5 or 10 years. And again, the cost to do that analysis across your municipality, it appears could actually be covered by the stormwater utility itself. I'm going to not really spend too much time on this, but you also hear a lot about a tiered system. And from my interpretation and review of the act, this tiered system that you might find reference to is not something that is likely to work in the state. How does it actually work from the user side? Typically, it's we find that it's put into an existing billing system, whether it be monthly or quarterly, just as a single line entry. And that obviously minimizes the costs associated with startup. So here's a couple examples. Here's a property in Philadelphia that we've worked to get some credits for this property. Philadelphia has been doing it for a long time. They used to charge based on your water meter size, which of course didn't make any sense, but they more recently have shifted to this parcel based, and anyone can go online and find their impervious cover assessment and understand what it is that they're paying for and how they can reduce that fee. A lot of places are setting up a web interface. Here's the city of Allentown in Pennsylvania that you can see, and any user can go in there. And it sounds fancy and expensive, but these things are actually, these kind of web interfaces are pretty easy to set up now and relatively inexpensive to maintain. This is the big question everyone wants to know. Not the $1 million question, the $8 question, I guess it turns out. How much, what are the typical rates? What's working in other places? So I don't have examples for New Jersey because I mentioned there aren't any yet. But in Pennsylvania, not far away, where there again are more and more every year, I did a quick review of a couple dozen across the state, really, and found that most of those fell in the $5 to $10 range per month per residential unit, and with an average of about $8, which is approaching $100 a year. The average residential unit size of the ones that I reviewed was 2,850 square feet, and the actual average ERU rate was $6.43. But when I adjusted them all to compare apples to that 2,800 square feet, it comes out to about $8 a month, which, if you work in bigger numbers, is about $1,500 per impervious acre per year. No trend between population, some lower than 2,000 people up to 1.6 million. Didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to that. And of course, all these are different places that have different problems. We would never expect these to all be the same. But interestingly, they're not far off from the national averages. So that's what's happening locally, at least in Pennsylvania. So we mentioned the credit system. Ed said that this is a requirement for New Jersey, and that's a good thing. From my review, more than 90%, almost all utilities have a credit system, and that's really one of the key benefits. So you can do retrofits, you can get credit for retrofits. Utilities are driving stormwater retrofits in other places. Typically, the return on investment period is not, it's not 2 years or 5 years, but it's enough to make people start to think about it and keep it in mind and actually do some things, including in Philadelphia and other places. It's also a big incentive for them to maintain existing structures. We'll talk about that more. And also removal of what I call kind of legacy impervious cover. And this is, again, where we can get that potential uplift in terms of reduced flooding and water quality improvement. So again, you can think of a stormwater utility as another carrot or stick, depending on what you're into. But again, an example of legacy impervious cover that it could quickly become cost effective to remove if it's not being used. And then we also have, every municipality's worst nightmare is the privately owned facilities. We're trying to enforce O&M. These scenes you've probably seen in your municipality. These are some local examples that I was digging up from my pictures. And this would enable these municipalities either to give credits or in cases like these to not give credits. And that's another way that you can use this to, from an enforcement standpoint, if you want. Maybe that's not the right word, but just inspection, O&M, all these things can be covered. So is it right for your municipality? That's really what this feasibility study is all about. And I look at a feasibility study as really like the Cliff Notes version of the actual utility implementation. There's a lot of municipal specific things to consider. You have a unique user base, a unique population and land use characteristics. I do think that this is going to happen in the state. I think that the narrative will be very different 5 or 10 years from now. And I think there will be a lot of adopters. There are specific things to consider though. The process generally develop a rough financial forecast, go through the data that you have, do again, a kind of high altitude view GIS analysis, get some rough definition of a rate structure, and of course the credit program. And there does need to be community engagement and education all along the way. And that's really what this is a fact-finding mission, informative. But that community engagement, it needs to be early, often, but it most importantly needs to be targeted. So in the feasibility stage, you need the right people in the room to make the informed decision before you go completely public with it, because you need to get those people either on board or perhaps they decide that it's not the way they want to go before you solicit more widespread input, because you don't want to be derailed and miss out on something that would really be beneficial to the majority of your residents. And again, the key is to identify those key contacts. So I mentioned this before, it's a fact-finding mission. It's not a recommendation. People, if it's going to succeed, the people in that position need to be convinced that it's going to succeed, because that's the way to make anything work, quite frankly. And so the primary purpose here is to inform those decision makers or the process, and some real keys on that. And there's Brianne will talk about some more resources for you here, but the key thing I want to drive home is the key stakeholder engagement. And then you go through the process. You identify the existing capital funding mechanisms, revenue that you've needed in the past to address concerns, and whether or not you're where you need to be in terms of your level of service. And then of course the nuts and bolts of it should provide a general framework for the fee structure and those ERU estimates to give people some idea of where what this would look like to a user. So there are some common drivers for stormwater utilities. That I think from a public standpoint, these are things that most people can get behind. Clean water, taking a proactive as opposed to a reactive approach to existing drainage issues, addressing drainage related public safety concerns, where you have not just nuisance flooding, but maybe some more severe issues caused by undersized or dilapidated infrastructure. One of those examples I showed you of the basins kind of in bad shape was periodically flooding a major highway and a local road, and really that was one of the impetus for them actually making some improvements there. So also maintaining and upgrading existing infrastructure. I think the public is becoming increasingly aware of the infrastructure issue that we have in the state and the country. And then, of course, you know, those large nuts that you just can't quite crack, that you're kicking the bucket continuously year after year down the street, that are just a little bit too big to bite off. This enables you to plan accordingly for them and maybe realize some of those projects. So what are you going to get from the feasibility study? You really are looking to summarize, you know, a list of the pros and the cons for the unique characteristics of your New Jersey municipality. There are some things that the context is everything here. Some things I didn't mention that might be important or not. Nonprofits, for example, that could be a really important characteristic for your municipality or not. That could go either way. And the reason I bring up nonprofits is this is a fee for service, so they're not exempt. And so large universities, not-for-profit hospitals and things like that. And those could be some sensitive stakeholders as well. But these are things that need to be factored in. And of course, obviously, you're going to get an estimate for a fee structure and estimated fees. And most importantly, perhaps an outline of the next steps. So should the decision makers decide that this is they want to take this to the next level, to get approval and go on. And again, I'll leave it to Brianne to summarize some of the other resources that they've already prepared to make that process even easier. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dana from here, and I look forward to answering any questions you have at the end. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Clay. So now that you've seen some general expectations from a stormwater feasibility study scope of work, I'm going to walk through a little bit about the process of how do you find the right consultant to assist you. So the first step here is, once you're ready to move forward with the feasibility study, is to put out a request for proposals, an RFP, to find the right consultant for the job. Many of municipalities or counties likely have a procurement department that do this on a regular basis. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here on what to expect, but focus on the key elements and the things that will define hiring the right person. So when you're preparing that RFP, you keep in mind some of the components listed here. But most importantly, in order to really get a proposal that helps to meet your expectations of what you want to get out of the project, is to include specific details in your scope of work, deliverables that you expect to receive at the end of the project. Some things that Clay mentioned earlier that might include specific maps, graphs, whether your report will be polished or it will just be a simple report, the utility fee estimates. Do you want the raw data or the GIS later? Is really defining what those deliverables are. Equally important is to estimate the number of meetings that the consultant might want to attend. This is really important to define, because if this includes stakeholder engagement, and if you as a municipality, county, utility decide that you're going to lead the process, that may include setting up or inviting participants or facilitating discussions, or you may decide you want the consultant to lead that process. But either way, you should include expectations of what that process looks like and who will be leading that process, because that'll significantly drive the cost of the project if you're having a consultant lead that project, whereas you may choose to absorb that and do that in-house, and you may be better positioned to. It depends on your municipality. And you may look at different groups, community leaders, officials, and that really could change the number of meetings that can be held, especially if they're in person versus virtual. So defining that really will drive the cost of the scope. Next slide, Clay. So once you've received some proposals, selecting the right consultant to lead this effort will be the next step here, and evaluating whether the right one for the job. So how do you do that if a stormwater utility has never been implemented in New Jersey? Well, I think that it's really important to keep an eye on specific qualifications that are provided in those proposals and the key experience. So for resumes, for example, you want to make sure that you have a project team that has a lead water resource engineer who has experience in New Jersey, and even better, if possible, an engineer that's local, that knows the municipality or has worked within the county, because really knowing that local landscape, having relationships with community leaders and regulators, and knowledge of the New Jersey stormwater rule, especially, and New Jersey stormwater regulations, is going to be key throughout the analysis process, the feasibility process. So, and if you're expecting to have the consultant lead the stakeholder process, you want to make sure they have someone who's a trained facilitator or communication specialist that can really craft an engagement strategy that will work for this step in the process, this feasibility study step, that allows you to gather feedback that your municipality can use to make the right decision whether a stormwater utility is right for you. And then of course you want to have a GIS analyst as part of that team, because mapping is really a key part of the process. For project examples, because there's no stormwater utilities currently in New Jersey, you should look for ones that show local stormwater knowledge. Perhaps a consultant or a water resource engineering firm or an engineering firm has constructed stormwater management, green infrastructure projects. The projects have used relevant GIS data, like New Jersey DEP has impervious surface layers, as Clay mentioned, land use, land cover. All of this is really important. Navigating that, having used it before in other types of projects may be really helpful in terms of evaluating experience. And then finally, for this process, being able to translate technical information into a form that the public or community groups or community leaders can really absorb and understand is an important part of qualifications. So look for projects that they've done where they've successfully been able to translate that information, science communication. In my opinion, I think it's be more fruitful for a municipality or county or someone who's seeking out a potential stormwater utility to find someone who knows the New Jersey landscape, New Jersey stormwater regulations, is really well versed in that, over a consultant who may have conducted this in another state but is not local to New Jersey, because this is really a local process. So that's something to think about when you're evaluating the proposals. Of course, this is my recommendation, and it's really up to you to do what's best for your municipality or your area. Next slide, please, Clay. So the $1 million question, how much is this going to cost? Not only how much are residents going to pay, what Clay said, but how much is it going to cost you to do this? So at this stage, the stormwater utility feasibility stage, we're really talking about $20,000 to $40,000 in our experience for this feasibility study to occur. This range could depend on the size of your municipality, the expectations for engagement, and whether or not, a really important one, your data is in a usable format that can be easily taken and analyzed. And so there are a variety of places that this could be funded through your annual budget, your municipal budget, or possible through grant funding. As we learned today, it sounds like New Jersey League of Conservation Education Fund has some available funding for Delaware watershed municipalities or counties. So that's a great source. And so there's probably other ones out there as well. The really interesting part about this is that, as far as we understand the legislation, it says that you can use the funds generated from the stormwater utility to establish the utility. So the feasibility study is part of that process, and you could essentially, if you elect to move forward with implementing a utility, you could use those funds to pay for the process. So this is the feasibility study stage. You finalize your forecast, you do your financial forecast, rate structure, credit program. That's all in the next step. And then say you decide to implement it and you launch it and you have your dedicated source of funding. What's really, I think, important is that you can use this fund as leverage for other projects in the future. So a lot of grant programs like New Jersey 319 grant funding or National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NIFWF grant funding, they require a match funding, which is usually like 25 to 50% of the project cost. And that's often a hurdle for municipalities or nonprofits or partnerships that are looking to do innovative stormwater projects or water quality type of projects. And so having this dedicated resource, it can really be a driver for gaining even more future grant funding on stormwater projects. So with that, I'll kick it back over to Clay.
Yes, yeah, thanks a lot, Dana. And our contact information is here. First initial C Emerson at Princeton Hydro. You can reach out with any additional questions. We will get to some questions. We did want to thank New Jersey League of Conservation Voters, Flood Defense New Jersey, and New Jersey Future for making this happen. But most importantly, I want to turn it over now to Brianne Callahan from New Jersey Future. So we can get to her and get to some of your questions. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Brianne.
Thanks, Clay. I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, can everybody see it? Awesome. Okay, great. So thanks to everyone for allowing me to join you tonight. As Clay mentioned, my name is Brianne Callahan. I'm the Stormwater Manager at New Jersey Future. Tonight, I'll briefly spotlight some helpful tools and resources available to localities who are considering a stormwater utility. So move on. Okay, before I get to that, I'd like to give you a little background on New Jersey Future. We envision healthy places for our residents and visitors to live, work, and play, where communities have safe streets and clean waterways that are free from flooding and pollution. We're a nonprofit located in Trenton, and we work throughout the state on land use and infrastructure issues such as stormwater utilities. As Ed, Clay, and Dana have mentioned throughout this presentation, the reason why we're talking to you about stormwater utilities is that infrastructure and stormwater management measures are expensive, and stormwater utility can help provide the funding needed. So now that we've gotten into the weeds a little bit, I'd really like to pivot and introduce our New Jersey Stormwater Utilities Resource Center. You can find the Resource Center at stormwaterutilities.njfuture.org. And here is what the homepage looks like. So what's the purpose of the Resource Center? In designing the Resource Center, we set out to accomplish three specific things. We wanted to provide municipal and county officials specifically and utilities with the tools to help them investigate a stormwater utility. We wanted to educate the public on stormwater utility basics, and we want to provide an ongoing repository for the latest information on stormwater utilities. And as was mentioned earlier in the presentation, we have no stormwater utilities in New Jersey as of yet. So these are all national best practices from throughout the country. And has also been mentioned, this is nothing new. We are the 41st state to enact enabling legislation. There are a multitude of areas that have already kind of worked the kinks out in various iterations. So that's what we compiled all of this data into our Stormwater Utility Resource Center. So the Resource Center has detailed information about how to get started. This includes how localities typically manage stormwater as it is, what options are available in terms of how you can structure a stormwater utility, what is a stormwater utility. It goes through key benefits, common myths, which is extremely important because there's a lot of misinformation out there. And in the New Jersey legislation is also very specific. There are specific things that can be done in other municipalities, in other states that can't be done in New Jersey, and vice versa. And then, of course, it talks about all the different stormwater utilities throughout the United States. As Clay mentioned in his presentation, and Dana also talked about, public outreach is key to this entire process. So as you can see on the Resource Center here, we've got a whole section about building public support. And really, that section itself is very detailed and talks about who your stakeholders need to be, who you need to reach out to really start the process and keep it going throughout the entire stormwater utilities investigation through implementation. Now, as part of the Resource Center, we have a list of potential stakeholders and committee members. This includes, people with a lot of impervious cover, environmental groups. You're talking hospitals, major commercial employers, major industrial employers, major malls and school districts and churches, real estate companies, all of the folks that would really want to have a voice and get a good understanding to avoid misinformation about stormwater utilities. And then the next thing that is also really useful is the potential stakeholder committee meetings and topics. And again, on the Resource Center page, you'll see under our outreach section, This breaks down meeting by meeting the types of things that you'll want to talk about, who are the folks that you want to include, and what the program needs are. Even includes a field trip of how you might want to go about taking a look at some of the areas of stormwater management concern, and also areas in other places that have successfully implemented things like green infrastructure. So this is our resource center page. If there's anything to take away from my presentation, this is probably the most important page on our entire resource center site. The section includes the latest information on stormwater utilities in New Jersey and across the nation. It includes general overviews, technical, legal, and financial information that is New Jersey specific, public outreach, case studies. We have a mapping and impervious cover section. In the climate, there's a climate and flooding section. Specifically, actually, to go back a second, the mapping and impervious cover section is an interactive map. We have partnered with NJ Map from Rowan University, and they have provided us with the capability to be able to click on the map itself and see where your impervious cover data is from where you live. And it's based off of the 2015 NJDEP impervious cover data, which is the latest data available. And the other thing that we also have that's very useful is a section on grants. There's also a interactive grant section where you can go and filter, what type of, whether you're a municipality or a nonprofit, who you are and what your needs are, and it will give you a better idea of what sort of grant funding you might be, you might be able to avail yourself of. Okay, some other resources that we have in addition to the Stormwater Utilities Resource Center website itself is a pro bono consultants list. And we've been very fortunate to have folks like Princeton Hydro and other folks here that you see on this list. And this is not an, a conclusive list. It's just a screenshot of the list that we have. We have a more extensive list of pro bono consultants who have actually offered to provide limited support to localities, to sit down with the localities and talk about how to get started, specific issues of concern, and then potential funding, opportunities that come to mind, come to mind right away. If you are a consultant, we've got any consultants on, listening today too, we've got on the website, on the resource center page, on the resources page itself, is a sign up for consultants who would be interested in providing support. The list is there as well. So the way that you can avail yourself of that, if you're a municipality, is simply download the list, take a look, see if there are any firms on the list that you'd like to talk to. We encourage folks to call up a couple of firms and talk to them about what their what their approaches are. And we're, like I said, we're so grateful to the firms that we have on the list for providing this type of support, because we understand how difficult it is to get started. Okay. And on the website itself, as I mentioned, this is the home page. There are two ways to go about accessing the resources. You can go across the top bar that you see. I think you can see my cursor here. And across the top, it starts out with home and ends with resources. You can click on resources through there. And then there are three buttons in the middle here. We typically focused for municipal officials around establish a stormwater utility. And if you go in through that button, you'll be able to see all of the resources for municipalities to get started, and all of the other resources that are available, including the grant funding opportunities. And then there's two more things I'd like to talk about. Our peer learning network is another resource that we have available. If you need help understanding how a stormwater utility can pay for all of the problems that you have, we have this peer learning network, which is an initiative that matches mentor cities in other states with New Jersey localities who are interested in learning more about a stormwater utility. And this has been really, really helpful for us. We've got localities in, all across the country who have different, populations, different geographic considerations, who've agreed to be mentors to our New Jersey municipalities. So we're really excited about that. And the way to avail yourself of that is to fill out the form on the Resources Center page. That form will go directly to me, and we'll be able to hook you up with a list of localities that you'll be able to contact, and you can decide how many and who you'd like to contact. And then in addition to that, we also have been doing presentations to council members, environmental commissions. My contact information is here. You can reach me at bcallahan@njfuture.org. Or you can send an info message through stormwaterutilities.njfuture.org. We have other resources available, so we'd love to hear from you. We do have, funding, ideas on funding, federal funding. We just have been speaking with the Department of Agriculture, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who has some creative ways that they can use their funding. So if folks are looking for funding, we'd love to hear from you. We'd love to work with you to help you get started. And with that, I'll pass it back to Ed.
Well, thanks, Bree. One of the first question I'm going to ask you actually has to do with, are there any examples of feasibility studies on the website in the resources you have?
Examples of feasibility studies?
Yeah, that was one of the questions that was asked by Hillary. She was wondering, or maybe Clay or Dana, if you know of any. There's folks would like to see what, we talked about what a feasibility study is, but if you're anything like me, I'm a visual learner. Where do I look at one to see what is it? Not what I think it is, what I heard you say. Do we have some samples, some models?
I think there will be soon, but I would point out that some of the resources that Brianne summarized are kind of the whole picture. So that those case studies that she mentioned are extremely helpful. They're going to be more informative than in my opinion, than a completed feasibility study would be, because they really go into depth. I think there was another question in the comments about, how are these? Are there some summaries of how this? How these worked, examples of how they worked in other states, how effective have they been in achieving their goals, I think was the question. And I think some of those resources that Brianne pointed out will answer that question even better than a feasibility study, a sample one would. But Brianne, you could probably add to that.
Yeah, we kind of felt the same way. Some of the feasibility studies can be really dense. And of course, if you're looking at them from other locations, other localities, in many cases, they don't take into account the same sort of things that New Jersey would be looking at. So the case studies is really where we've kind of, pointed folks to for that sort of information.
Awesome. So another question we had, Isla had asked about when you were talking, Dana, the cost of a feasibility study depends on the data that's available. And I don't think that was exactly clear, right? So can you explain a little bit more about what kind of data makes a feasibility study cheaper or more affordable, and what kind of lack of data would make it more onerous on the consulting firm, therefore more expensive?
Clay, if you want to take that one, that would be fine. But essentially, it's the format of the data. So if your data is in a GIS ready shapefile that can be analyzed, it makes it a lot easier for the consultant rather than have to manually create those files.
Yeah, and to add to that, a lot of the different municipalities may do different things, I think, across the board in terms of knowing what previous expenses, what the average budget is that they use for stormwater purposes. So if the municipality were to kind of have a better handle on that, or spend kind of their own time getting that stuff organized to understand what their current level of service is, that would be something that would make the feasibility study a a little more perhaps cost effective from the consultant side, because that information would kind of be packaged up and already understood, and not a whole lot of pre-processing that would need to go into that. But beyond that, I mean, don't think that you need to have already completed an impervious area assessment of your municipality or something like that. I would expect that most municipalities may not have that right now, and that would certainly be part of the final implementation. But in the feasibility study, it would be kind of a higher altitude view of that, your consultant would be able to handle without that information. So it's not too big of a burden. I don't think it's too heavy of a lift in terms of data preparation.
And that's one of the reasons the cost of the study varies, right? It's like the size of the municipality. Someone had asked like about a regional utility, if there was a feasibility study on the potentiality of that and what it might look like and how it looks to be equitable, meaning whoever's contributing the most to stormwater pollution would be paying the most for the stormwater pollution that's what the equitability piece is that a regional one, because it's more larger geography, more stakeholding, would cost more data to go through, as you guys are mentioning. Does that sound about right? I was answering in the chat, and I wanted to make sure I was accurate for the person that flew up. Virginia had asked that.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, awesome. And then, Isla also asked a really great question, which is, are there examples that come to mind? I know there are case studies on the website. I put the link in from New Jersey Future. We have them at Flood Defense New Jersey about successful implementation. But any that you want to highlight, Clay, that you've worked with, where a town went from rainy, we call it sunny day flooding. No particularly large storm. It's like a cloudy big rain day, and there's more of this nuisance flooding from more intense and frequent storms and high tides higher than normal because of climate change and rising seas, like where it's been implemented and we've seen a reduction in the flooding and improvement in water quality. Because that's ultimately what we're driving here for, right? We're saving people from having to, gut their businesses and homes in a flood situation and get poisoned from fishing or drinking or swimming in polluted water.
Yeah, and I think some of the case studies that you mentioned that New Jersey Future has summarized so well, we'll talk about that. They have a dedicated source of funding to do projects. Some of them aren't just some of them. I think it was the city of Lancaster had some really interesting projects and some small, what do you call them, like parklets, green infrastructure parklets and things that they were able to implement. And I think there were a couple other municipalities that have done some things like that in kind of semi-urban areas that really provide some uplift where it's needed the most. But really, any of those municipalities that have implemented are reaping the benefits, of improved stormwater management, upkeep of aging infrastructure, and the water quality improvements that come along with it. It's a good question, though.
One other question or comment had sort of come up on there about the grant program. So New Jersey League of Conservation Voters Education Fund has funding. It's geographically restricted to the Delaware River watershed. Molly put a link to the website where the RFP, our request for proposals from municipalities are. Bree had mentioned there are other funding available through departments of agriculture, et cetera. And there's a tool to look that up. If you have any questions, you can contact any of us. We'll try to hook you up. If you're interested, we want to help you. In addition, if a stormwater utility feasibility study then goes forward to create a stormwater utility, any costs associated with the study can be paid from future revenue that might be collected. So that's important to note, sort of as we look there. And there was another comment, I don't know who made it, but one thing to sort of underscore, if you're a community like, we'll just say Princeton, okay? Princeton has this like massive university that takes up a lot of land. and universities don't pay taxes. And, there was a question like, who pays for stormwater management now? And I think the answer across the board is taxpayers are paying for it. But if you're Princeton and you can't collect taxes from Princeton University, they have a lot of concrete and pavement, and they're producing a lot of polluted stormwater that's running off, and the town people are having to chip in for that. So that's one way to recover in an equitable way, meaning the amount of pollution they're creating, to actually have that revenue available to put in green infrastructure, to clean up the water, absorb it, like the natural land that would have been there if the university wasn't, would have done. And that's the whole idea here. And so areas that have a lot of folks that are not contributing to the tax base that is currently paying for this kind of infrastructure, it would become available. There was a question here too, like, how does this affect a renter? If I'm in a building or a house and I'm renting it, what should someone who's renting expect to see if this were to come to their community? We've got to stump the experts. That is always the goal in a webinar. Whoever asked that question, you get a gold star.
So
or
I
they can't
think,
find the mute button fast enough.
and the legislation provides that the stormwater utility fee can be passed down to renters. So it can either be paid for by the the landlord, or it can be passed through in rent down to the renter.
And it's my understanding too, people want to know what the numbers are. So Clay, you provided numbers, and that's great. And that's based on data. But my understanding is it can be any amount. A town, a region can set it as low as they wanted to, and as high as the community can bear to address the problem. I don't think in 1 year you're going to collect enough money to solve a $16 billion problem. That's not going to be like a fair or nice way to do it. But if you don't start somewhere, the bills are going to get higher, the destruction is going to get greater, and the environment's going to become more impaired. But is that true, Clay? Is it in fact that they can charge anything? It could be, $5 a year instead of, on average, I think I added up in my head around 60.
Yeah, it does need to be based on the revenue, and you want to hit the mark. You don't want to overshoot it. So it is important for municipalities to have an understanding of what they're currently spending and whether or not they're keeping up with the needs. Because you may need, frankly, you may need more than you're currently spending. You may be slipping behind on projects as things age. So yeah, you'd want to hit that target just as closely as you can. So that's where that previous data is going to be important, and developing your financial forecast.
Because the goal is really to make reductions in pollution, reductions in the quantity of water to help reduce the flooding. So you don't want to spend so little that you're not making a dent in that ultimate goal, which totally makes sense. There are some other folks chiming in about great work they're doing, which I love to see. So I want to give the towns that are moving forward and exploring this a big round of applause. Educating the public is a big piece of what needs to happen, because I think there's a lot of misinformation about how it's currently being funded, and how moving it from a tax, which is currently part of their property tax, to a fee, which requires reductions if you reduce the amount of pollution that you're creating, benefits a community, and how ultimately it can help save meaningful dollars and improve quality of life and health in communities. It's hard for folks to sort of wrestle around that. So if you're interested in having presentations done or having community meetings, we're all available. Molly, who you can't see on the screen right now, Riley, who works for New Jersey League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, she's waving, is available. Bree, they often do a roadshow together, which is fun. And then I just want to thank the folks from Princeton Hydro, Clay and Dana, for all the work that you do, for joining us tonight to share your knowledge and experience with feasibility studies and take time to answer questions. I think we already got a chance to get through all the questions in the chat. Thank you guys for staying over, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and continuing to productively reduce the amount of stormwater that is making its way polluted into our waterways, streams, and rivers. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Molly, folks at the New Jersey LCV Education Fund for putting this together, and our guests tonight. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
See you guys. Thank you.